So I have everything attached now. The epoxy, I saturated with epoxy, but I had a little too much, so I just poured the excess into the bottom. This is not thickened epoxy. I resealed all the inside with a non-thickened epoxy because I wanted it to be sealed up tight, and I also wanted it to be the epoxy to absorb into the wood before I put down the thickened epoxy, because I didn't want poor adhesion on the surface. If I put just thickened epoxy against the wood, I don't think that it would absorb into the grain to the same degree that the regular thickness or thin epoxy would. So I saturated the inside. I wet the bottom sides of these little supports here, except for this board that's just providing tension to these here. I left the top edge of these dry, so whenever I put down the piece of plywood, I won't have to sand this as much to get good adhesion, because you don't want the epoxy to be dry whenever you add fresh epoxy to the bottom piece of plywood. So this will save me a little bit of sanding. These joints here, where this board meets this board, I did put thickened epoxy in the edges, on the edges, and in the little parts where this contacts this board on the bottom sides. I also put thickened epoxy here and some particularly ugly fillets here, so that it would, bond to that. And since there's no screw where these meet the side of the hole, I put thickened epoxy so that it would bond with the fillets, so that it'd be less likely to shift side to side. There's also thickened epoxy where the little side pieces of wood meet this, and where it meets the hole, so it's less likely to shift. I didn't want to put just this one skinny board here to here to support all the way to the anchor, and I also wanted to have that little block there, if you can see it, that little block there to bear some of this weight, since this edge here has this plywood with thickened epoxy between this board and the plywood and screws. It's going to hold a lot more weight than this would had I not added in these little extra blocks. And here I've got a clamp just to kind of squeeze the sides of that board to the stem here. And I also put a screw that's kind of toe-nailed at an angle, kind of like that goes into the stem. And there's also a wedge in there with thickened epoxy, just to make it nice and snug. So I think it'll be pretty strong. And once this is all dried, probably the next few days, I'll pour the foam, level up to here and here, smooth it out, and then I'll come back with thin epoxy on the top pieces of the wood. I will have to sand these edges here, so whenever I apply the fillets, they'll bond properly, and here. But once the foam's in the bottom, level with this, I'll go ahead and put down the board that goes here, and I'll pour more foam into this once I have the little board that goes here up. So it'll have a little hollow area. Can't really see it very well for the tape, so let me squish that down. So the board will go here, and I'll pour the remainder of the epoxy to where it's filling up this whole cavity. Well, not epoxy, but the foam will fill all this. But it should work. All right, that's about it.